So good evening and welcome to the ZWAC show. ZWAC stands for the Zero Waste Advocacy Committee of the Northern California Recycling Association. We meet the second Tuesday of every month to talk about something new and interesting in the world of recycling and zero waste. So along with many major daily newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle within the past published what I thought was a shocking article, told me that in the plastics recycling process, which kind of is a negative process to begin with, in fact, the plastic people are making things worse by taking bad chemicals that are in electronic waste, using it in the recycling process to make new plastic stuff, particularly kitchenware. And that's making its way into your home. At least it used to. We threw all of ours out last week. So tonight, we're lucky enough to have with us Dr. Lydia Jahl of the Green Science Policy Institute, and she's going to talk to us about how in the world this got into the consumer kitchenware stream and how big a deal this is. So thanks for joining us, Lydia.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, John.
You work for the Green Science Policy Institute. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, sure. So we are a small NGO based in Berkeley, and we try to approach the topic of harmful chemicals from a class-based approach. So we look at different classes of chemicals, like highly fluorinated chemicals called PFAS. Those are the chemicals referred to as forever chemicals. Flame retardants, which we'll talk about today, and other classes of chemicals like antimicrobials and heavy metals. And so that we can approach these chemical classes from a precautionary perspective and really be sure that these chemicals are safe before we use them. And we work with other scientists to conduct research and then share that research with regulators, with businesses, with other academic scientists and other nonprofits, all towards reducing harmful chemicals in everyday products.
What kind of regulators do you work with? We have someone from Californians Against Waste on the call here.
Yeah, it really runs the gamut. So much of what we do is applicable to people not just in the U.S. but also internationally. But we keep most of our work in the U.S. on a federal level, sometimes on a state level within California, and help out in some other work in other states, and sometimes even more local than that, like sometimes talking to people in the city of Berkeley and seeing what they're doing. So it really varies.
What is your job like on a day-to-day basis?
That's a good question. It varies so much. It's hard to tell. It might be working on one of our research projects and emailing with university scientists to see, check in on how some research is going. It might be meeting with people at other nonprofits to sort of strategize and talk about problems that we've come across and see if they know about it, if they have any ideas. It might be talking with businesses that are trying to get out of harmful chemicals and sort of helping them strategize and making introductions for them so that they can work towards better products, and everything in between.
So how in the world did you get involved with this kind of business or industry? What prompted you to get into this?
Yeah, so I actually did my PhD in chemistry, studying atmospheric chemistry, because I was really concerned about climate changes. I know many of us are. Um, and while the work was really important, it was sort of work that would, have to be repeated and confirmed and then go into climate models. And then maybe 10, 15 years down the line, it would have a small impact. And so I wanted to do something that would have a more immediate impact in a really short time scale. And there's some things that you can do like that for climate, but as I learned more about different kinds of harmful chemicals, I realized that this is really, really serious, at least as serious as our climate emergency. And that if I worked in a small nonprofit and worked, collaboratively with businesses and regulators, that you can often get things done super quickly. Working that way, in the grand scheme of things, quickly, compared to say working at the EPA or something like that. So basically, I just wanted to do something that had a good impact that would use my chemistry skills and affect change in a short timeline.
So I'm going to go off topic for a second because you said you had studied atmospheric chemistry.
Mhm.
And I've been kind of interested in this idea that of capturing carbon dioxide emissions
Mhm.
and then compressing them and burying them. Are you involved in that at all? Or interested?
Yeah, sure. It wasn't my research specifically, but there's a lot of different ways of trying to reduce our carbon emissions and geoengineering to try to really impact climate change. I would say that carbon capture and sequestration, which is the general term for what you're talking about, it can have a place, but in general, it's really difficult and really energy intensive to take carbon dioxide, which is in our atmosphere only at a concentration of around 400 parts per million, um, and then purify it to just carbon dioxide and sequester that in the ground. Um, it can sometimes be better in industrial processes where maybe they're already separating out different gases and maybe they already have a really concentrated stream of carbon dioxide. A lot of the times they actually just shoot that back into the atmosphere. And that's somewhere where carbon sequestration would be great because they've already, because of whatever other process they're doing, making a concentrated stream of carbon dioxide, then it's a lot more efficient to capture that and sequester it than people who are trying to do it with ambient, regular outside air.
Well, I've kind of wondered about it because in zero waste, we have a firm rule about no burn, no bury. And
Mhm.
when you're talking about burying
Yeah.
carbon dioxide, is that a good thing or not, or maybe possibly a good thing and possibly not?
I think if it's done well, it's perfectly fine. It's different because it's should be really just carbon dioxide versus a lot of our waste streams, which is a lot more than just one molecule.
Well, so then turning back to tonight's subject, why are there flame retardants in my kitchen spatula?
Yeah, so this was something that had been suspected for a while, and researchers around the globe had found flame retardants in recycled black plastics before, but the study that's been all over the news recently, and for good reason, is because it was the first one that found this in products that were purchased in the United States. Um, and the researchers were able to sort of look at the different types of plastic that they found flame retardant chemicals in and realized that the plastic types that had the highest concentrations of flame retardants were those that are typically used in electronics. So many electronics have complex, confusing flammability standards that lead to flame retardant usage. And if those plastics that were once used in electronics go into the recycling stream without the awareness that they contain harmful chemicals, then it's really easy to just, you know, it's fine to want to recycle and reuse the material, but when you don't know that there's harmful chemicals in it, that's how you can get into trouble, especially with products that have such high chances of exposure, like children's toys or kitchen spoons and things like that. So it's this electronics to kitchenware that's the real issue.
So was it kind of like a detective novel where they could test and find that there were flame retardants in my spatula, and then they had to try to make assumptions about how that could have happened?
Um, a bit, but these specific researchers, as well as many others, have known for sort of years to decades that there are flame retardants in electronics, and they've studied which specific flame retardants are in which specific plastics that are in, say, old TV enclosures. And so they were able to use sort of all that background knowledge, plus the testing that they did in this study to come to that conclusion.
So why, how did it happen that somebody is using electronic waste with flame retardants to make new plastic stuff? How does that happen?
That's not my expertise, and I was wondering if anyone on this call might know more about how that exact recycling flow goes. I think, the part that I do know is that there's a lot of people concerned with the amount of plastic that we generate every single day. And so the sort of one of the naive solutions to that is to reuse the plastic as much as possible. And sometimes that is great and doesn't come with any consequences. But you see, brands and corporations for even things like clothing and food packaging will make commitments to say, 50% of our plastic is recycled or something like that. And so when there's these commitments to use more recycled plastic without learning in detail about the topic first, I think that's how we get to these situations.
During our half-hour cocktail time, we have someone from CAW, and she was telling us that it's more like the company that collects e-waste in California ships it overseas,
Mhm.
and overseas it gets mixed and mashed and done something with, and maybe they're not as careful as we would like them to be, and that's how it comes to pass.
Mhm.
So, in are you is the Green Science Policy Institute now focused at all on this to try to, persuade legislators and others as you do that maybe this needs some tinkering with regulation?
Yeah, so I think something we always advocate for is that when you're considering like climate, plastic, and toxics, they are all related. You shouldn't just treat them all as a silo because if you don't realize they're connected, that's how you get into situations like these. Um, I think we also see a lot of legislation where there might be restrictions on certain harmful chemicals, including flame retardants. But because people want there to be a circular economy, they'll greatly reduce those restrictions and sometimes even completely eliminate recycled materials from those allowed levels of harmful chemicals. And so we say like it's great that you're trying to use recycled materials, but a chemical is just as harmful whether or not it's in a virgin plastic than a recycled plastic. Your body doesn't know the difference. So we definitely urge regulators to treat recycled materials with the same scrutiny they would treat other materials. But I think one aspect that we're focused more on is thinking about how the flame retardants get into the electronics in the first place
Mhm.
and whether or not they're helpful in the electronics. So there's to make a long story short, flame retardants used to be prevalent in our furniture in the United States. So all your upholstered furniture at home, sofas, upholstered chairs, things like that, there would all be flame retardants in those. And what our group and many others realized about a decade ago, over a decade ago now, um, is that the flame retardants didn't actually make furniture safer, but they did lead to us all being exposed to these carcinogenic and neurotoxic chemicals. And so they worked to revise the flammability standard that led to the flame retardants being used in the first place, pointing out that this standard didn't actually help prevent fires. And so in electronics, it's a little trickier. We do know that some uses of flame retardants in electronics, like in printed circuit boards, that has been shown to be helpful in reducing fires. But there's other uses like in an enclosure around the whole, say, TV or monitor in areas around the electronics where there's not a lot of power of high voltage systems, things like that. The flame retardants aren't actually helpful, and those are the black plastics that get recycled into our kitchen utensils and kids' toys and things like that. So we're focused on that first stage of the problem, questioning flammability standards and encouraging those who make the standards and those who require the standards to make sure that they have a proof of fire safety benefit before just assuming that they're a good thing. Of course, if flame retardants weren't harmful, then it wouldn't matter as much if you had flammability standards that didn't have a proof of efficacy. But unfortunately, because the chemicals are bad, then we really need to see if they're helpful before we include them in a lot of the products.
So for the people that haven't read this report, how bad are these chemicals? How toxic are they?
Yeah, they're definitely not good. They're the kind of chemicals that the more you study them, the more health issues you realize that they can cause. So many flame retardant chemicals, especially those that have bromine in them, the brominated flame retardants that they discuss a lot in this paper, they're found to be carcinogenic. A study that came out earlier this year found that those with the highest amount of these brominated flame retardants in their bodies compared to the people with the lowest sort of quarter range of flame retardants in their bodies, they had a 4 times higher risk of dying from cancer. And that was a huge epidemiological study. So there was studies to show that the chemicals were carcinogenic, but then just looking as a whole at a huge US population, finding that there's that 4 times increased risk, I think is kind of mind blowing. We also know that the chemicals can be neurotoxic, so they can lead to something as sort of not as bad as like behavior issues in children, but they're also known to cause decreases in IQ. So one of the PBDE chemicals that were found in some of these is associated with a 3 to 5 average IQ point drop in American children because of all of its use in furniture foam and electronics.
So I've also seen the term endocrine disruptor. What's that?
Yeah, endocrine disruptor is anything that messes with your endocrine system. So you can think like hormone production. It can sometimes mean that they're even like obesogens and contributing to our obesity epidemic. What's interesting about endocrine disrupting chemicals is, we often think like the dose makes the poison. And if you're thinking about something like lead in lead paint or in old leaded gas, the more lead you have, the worse your health issues would become. But for something like endocrine disrupting chemicals, it's kind of trickier for the body to figure out. And sometimes you can get this sort of change in how your body reacts so that the really, really tiny levels you're exposed to can actually be even worse. So that's, I think, a great point because it means that even if you're only exposed a little bit to these chemicals, they can still have harmful effects.
So what should I worry about more, the flame retardant in my spatula or the PFAS in my kitchen skillet?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think any scientist or probably toxicologist has directly studied those to compare. Um, they both have harmful and sometimes similar health impacts. I would say that it depends if, yeah, whoever suggested wooden spoons and cast iron skillets, right on. I would say that a like nonstick Teflon pan that is not scratched up at all is probably better than like putting a hot liquid into a like any foodware that's made of black plastic. But it can be hard to make those trade-offs.
Well, and like with PFAS, how do I know if there's flame retardants in my spatula or not?
That's a good question, and it's so important because the everyday consumer can't know, which is why I'd say just in general avoid it as best as you can. Um, this study found that about 10% of the samples the black plastic samples they had flame retardants. So it's not everything. 10% is a lot better than if they found 50%. And hopefully as people become more aware and more regulations are put in place, that number should also slowly come down. But unfortunately, there's no way And, sometimes often we'll advocate for reaching out to brands. If you have a favorite brand of kitchenware, reach out and ask them. And that's definitely a good thing to show brands that you care. But oftentimes they won't know either. So it's tricky in that way too.
Is it only black plastic or is it all colors plastic?
It tends to be black plastic because that's what electronics enclosures tend to be. But it's possible there are other colors as well. It's just the primary color that's used in electronics is black.
And should I get rid of my black plastic coffee maker?
I would advocate for making coffee in a way that makes sure that the hot liquid doesn't touch plastic.
Uh-oh, okay. Thought you were going to say that. So my son is grown and out of the house, so I don't know anything about the toys that you're talking about. What kinds of plastic toys should parents be worried about?
Yeah, I mean, I think parents should be most worried about the toys that their younger children put in their mouths, just because then that's a really direct exposure route. I think some of the ones they tested in the study were like little, car toys and things like that. Um,
You-
so if your child
you-
isn't putting it in their mouth, it's better, but it's
but all teething rings are plastic, aren't they?
Mhm. Yeah, I think you can find some now that are like wood, but I don't know how much the babies like that. It seems a little hard, but I don't know. Yeah, that's hard.
Do you see anything on the regulatory horizon for this?
Not yet. I think Europe is doing a little bit better of a job than we are here. They have restricted certain brominated flame retardants in recycled materials. Um, some US states do restrict flame retardant chemicals in certain products, but not like kitchenware or toys, more like furniture. Some have, like New York State actually has banned certain flame retardants from being in electronics enclosures. And so that's good because if they stop being used in the electronics themselves, then they, even if they are recycled into your kitchen spatula, then it won't be there. That being said, there's other replacement flame retardants that are still allowed that also are connected with health harm. So it's a slippery slope when you ban certain chemicals and then, you know, people switch to a different set of chemicals. Then you ban those and then they switch to a different set of chemicals. So you get this cycle of regrettable substitution when we don't have anything in place for that requires manufacturers to prove a chemical is safe before using it.
It's kind of like the PFAS story a little bit.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
So are there warning signs? I mean, I have 1 year of college chemistry behind me, so I know that bromine and fluorine are the same kinds of molecules.
Yep.
Should we focus on that? Is that a litmus test?
Yeah, it's a bit of a litmus test. So a lot of their bromine, chlorine, and fluorine belong to a group called halogens. And a lot of the time when you have organic molecules, so ones with carbon bonded to those halogen molecule atoms, um, that's where you get issues. And it's because the body doesn't really recognize that. There's no sort of natural things in our body that have those carbon to fluorine or carbon to bromine bonds. So our bodies don't know what to do with it, and that's when you get those health harms.
So should we ban chemicals that are bonded carbon and bromine chlorine?
I think to certain extents, I think there's certain uses that might be necessary as we have them now. But I think it's definitely I wouldn't jump to banning them all, but I would jump to analyzing them all and seeing if they are harmful or not. I think a lot of the time you would find out that they are. A lot of flame retardants are very similar in structure to pesticides that have been associated with harm. So you get that sort of family connection there. Like you're mentioning, PFAS are a huge problem, and that's all about the carbon fluorine bond. So between like the body not being able to recognizing it, and then also those bonds are very strong too. And so that means these chemicals are really hard to degrade. And that's how they can get easily from our products into the air where you can breathe them in, and then they can get into the water and into our water supply, and then they get into our food. And so it's not just the flame retardants being recycled into your black kitchenware. It's also about them getting into your food and water because of how we use them in products as well.
So I can see that you could be an effective chemistry advocate in talking to politicians, but at some point you must get pushback. What's the pushback line in your
That's
experience?
yeah, that's a good question. A lot of the time, the pushback can come from companies who don't want there to be a lot of regulation. A lot of the time, though, that's because they're um, just sort of happily ignorant of the harm of some of the chemicals that they might use. And so that's when we try to educate them and say, hey, these are actually pretty bad. Like, can you try to find a safer substitute? Um, I would say almost all of the true pushback comes from the chemical manufacturers themselves, the ones who are selling the PFAS or selling the flame retardants, um, which makes sense. Their entire business is based off of selling those chemicals. And our sort of message for them is, well, you have smart chemists and engineers and innovators. Why don't you just find a substitute and make sure it's safe before you start selling it? And they don't have to shut down their whole business. They can sell chemicals still, just chemicals that are safer.
And do they follow through with that suggestion?
Not too much. Maybe sometimes. I think it's hard. We don't often have direct conversations with the chemical manufacturers. It might be, maybe us testifying in some legislature to say that a bill is good because it does XYZ, and then they come and say the exact opposite thing. But I would say companies that make products are a lot more likely to try to do the right thing. And we've seen that with PFAS a lot of the time too, where they're trying to get PFAS out of your food packaging, your cosmetics, your textiles, and things like that.
Well, I was thinking about that. I'm using the term pushback, but it's really kind of a tug of war. And at least on the PFAS side, we've sort of pulled them across the line a little bit because there's real public awareness of it. There's real, regulatory strength. People actually look at the labels now on their Teflon pans, and if they see it's PFAS free, well, that's great because we'll believe the manufacturer. So if we've made progress on PFAS, how do we make the same progress on flame retardants?
Yeah, great question. I think pointing out that flame retardants can be similar to PFAS. So they're not quite as persistent, but they're still very persistent and can be found around the globe because of that, their persistence. Um, I think with PFAS, a lot of the time they're used to sort of improve a product's ability to do something, to be non-stick or to be waterproof. And so as long as you can find a substitute, that's fine. You can also often just get rid of the PFAS and have a slightly different product and it'd be fine. For flame retardants, it's different because they're often added to meet flammability standards. And so in that case, you can't just convince a manufacturer to change their product. You also have to change the standard. And that's something that can take 5, 10, 15 years. The standard setting organizations are often populated by people with financial conflicts of interest. And so it's a little harder to convince people because of that fact. But I think, just the amount of media that this study got and is making everyone go into their kitchen drawers and throw stuff out, just having people be aware and educating people, just like what has happened with PFAS, I think is a great first step.
You also have to get over the denial threshold because I don't want to believe that black plastic spoon I'm using to stir my boiling pasta is leaching anything out. Am I right to think that?
Yeah, no, it's so hard because you can't see it, you can't smell it, and that's true with PFAS and flame retardants a lot of the time. I think if there's maybe like other chemicals like PVC, plastics, things like that, things that have more of a smell or things that you can see with your eye, I think it's so much easier, even for people who understand that things can be invisible and still have effects. It can just be hard when there's no visual cue. So yeah, I definitely can see how, yeah, it's hard to understand how something that you can't see could be a problem. And I think that's why we still have this as an ongoing issue.
So as an advocacy organization, if people on this Zoom, are alarmed and they're interested in wanting to advocate for regulation or to, reduce risk, how can they get involved? What can they do?
Yeah, so I would say that reaching out to brands that you purchase from, um, if you look at your spatula and it's a brand, then reach out to them and say, hey, I heard about these harmful chemicals in my spatula. I want you to make spatulas that don't have harmful flame retardants. And at the same time, reaching out to your politicians to say, hey, I want you to write or support bills that will tighten regulations around these harmful chemicals and make it easier for me to have a safer levels of exposure. Um,
So there's
use
a,
your purchasing power too. Like for now, it's probably best to buy wooden spatulas or stainless steel spatulas and things like that because there's a lack of regulation. So if brands see, oh, everyone stop buying our black plastic, then that would be great. That sends a really clear message that people care about this.
so there's a couple of questions in the chat that are kind of similar. I'll paraphrase one. If I was a small manufacturer of products, is there a laboratory that I can go to that would, without charging me zillions of dollars, would tell me what's in my product?
Yeah, so there are labs that will do testing for flame retardant specifically. There's also labs that will do screening that they actually did in this study. So when they talked in the study about doing a quick screening on 200 samples and then only analyzing 20 samples in depth, that
Mhm,
quick screening is from an instrument called XRF,
mhm.
and it gives the levels of different elements that are present in the product. And that's how you can get a reading on bromine. And that's actually can be used by recyclers who are wanting to screen products before recycling them. They'll often use the XRF because it's really simple to use. They even make ones that are portable and you can walk around with it. Um, and so that's what people will use oftentimes to screen for, say, bromine or chlorine before using a feedstock.
So if I had a big pile of e-waste and I wanted to find out if there's any flame retardant in there, is I can take one of this portable device and sort of scan the big pile?
Yep. You'd have to scan every piece to know for sure.
Okay.
But yeah, you could do that.
I'd need to have an assembly line and do it.
Yeah, you're
How
right.
about for the consumer? If people want to know if their spatula has a flame retardant in there, can you get a test kit like you might for lead paint, for example?
You cannot. Unfortunately, it's harder to analyze than lead, so there's no like easy at home kit you can do. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's hard for bromine and chlorine, and it's even harder for fluorine, which is relevant to PFAS. So that's why it can be really hard for consumers. Mhm.
So how about black silicon spatulas? Are they equally bad?
They shouldn't be in general, but um I can't say that all black silicone is safe, but like on average, it should be better.
Well, this is really interesting. But we're at the point in the show where I usually turn this over to the audience to ask questions directly. So I think I'm going to do that now.
Sure, and I can answer a couple more in the chat too.
Okay. And I thank you for giving up your dinner time to do this.
Of course.
Sorry you missed the cocktail time though.
Yeah, no worries. I was at work but wanted to take this from home, so I was traveling during your cocktail half hour.
So let's see. I can see some hands. Crystal, did you have a question?
No, just giving a round of applause.
Okay.
I see a question about are there efforts to have a certification for consumer awareness around PFAS and flame retardant free? Um, there's some efforts. So like if you buy a new piece of furniture these days, it'll have a label on it which should say contains no flame retardant chemicals. That's something you want to check for flame retardants and furniture. Um, Certain electronics will get eco labels like EPEAT certified or TCO certified, and those will often have restrictions around these halogenated flame retardants. Um, my group maintains a list of PFAS-free products. If you go to pfascentral.org, we list a lot of products that commonly contain PFAS and have identified ones that the brands do not use PFAS in those products. And as far as certifications, I have heard that certain certification bodies like UL are looking into PFAS testing. So there's a possibility that in the future there would be more strict labels around that. I would say right now it's maybe coming down to state legislation. So as of January 1st in California, no more for most textiles and all cosmetics should no longer contain PFAS, but there's no testing yet. So I would say there's probably going to be some getting by, but at least there won't be any intentional use in products sold in California in 2025.
It's like a big whack-a-mole game. You whack one mole and it just comes up somewhere else.
Exactly.
Anybody have some questions for Lydia? Mary Lou?
Yeah, I think of the discussion you had early in talking, where all these things come from, and it sounds like they're everywhere, and in lots and lots of different kinds of products that people make throughout the whole production cycle. As recyclers, we're accustomed to thinking in cycles and going round and round, and we think it's always a good idea to recycle and put put these materials that we've put so much time and so much energy into manufacturing these things from fossils that aren't gonna, nobody's making more fossils, or at least it's a very slow process. So then you find out that they're contaminated with toxic things. For me, it's a question of interrupting the cycle of manufacturing. But then once we interrupt it, what do we do with what's left? If we it's fine to learn how to buy a product for ourselves that doesn't have these nasty things. But there's so much in products that have already been manufactured that are already distributed all over the world. And the whole planetary ecosphere is contaminated with this stuff. What kind of cleanup can be done?
Yeah,
Any
it's
ideas?
and that you make such good points. So thank you for that. I think it's hard because there's no perfect solution. Some people say, well, just trash it instead of recycle it. But then you have to make sure that your landfill is super good and never has any leaks or anything. And that's, known to never really work out perfectly, right?
No.
Other people, and especially the chemical manufacturers, will often say, well, just burn it. Then you get energy back from that. Which, I mean, sure, maybe, but then you're releasing all sorts of toxic fumes into the atmosphere. Even with really good emission control, you're still releasing harmful chemicals. And then you also catch those emissions somehow, even if you are catching them. And then what do you do with that cartridge or whatever? Then maybe that goes in the landfill, repeat the problem. Yeah. So there's the cycle too. Wastewater treatment can be helpful, but it's known to not entirely be able to catch all flame retardants or all PFAS, even when done super well. So right now we need to focus on trying to stop the new production as much as possible, but you're right that there's a whole legacy, so many millions of pounds of it already on the earth. So unfortunately, I can't give you, there's no one best solution.
Dang.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions in the chat. One is, should we worry about black plastic trays in microwavable containers?
It's possible. I don't know if there's a standard for microwavable plastics around flammability. That's a great question. There shouldn't be, because a microwave shouldn't actually make a plastic catch fire in that way. But in terms of how all these other black plastics get flame retardants from, recycling in a complicated supply chain, there definitely could be. In general, plastics will be more likely to leach out chemicals when they have something that's hot in them. So I would definitely say, even if you buy a microwave meal, just sort of pop it out of that plastic and put it in a bowl or a plate before you microwave it. Same with like hot liquids, best to have that in stainless steel or glass or ceramic if you can.
So what kind of legislation would you like to see California adopt to address flame retardants in plastic products?
Yeah, I would say that we should adopt legislation. It's hard to say what's ideal versus what is realistic. But ideally, anything that has to do with requiring recycled material should have strict allowances for harmful chemicals in those recycled products. It would be great if the people who make the chemicals and make the products containing them have to ultimately be responsible for them at the end of life. I think that would be super helpful. So it's not passed on always to the consumer or to the recycler or to, people who are just trying to do good and recycle products. Um, I think we could also see increased regulation and legislation around where the chemicals are used in the first place. So in the electronics, in the automobiles. So we just did a study this year finding that cars are chock full of flame retardants as well. So if we can have more legislation stopping the use at the beginning, then we need less control at the end of the life cycle.
You've made that's a good point you keep making. We need to stop it at the beginning. Otherwise, it just keeps cycling around and around, right, Mary Lou? You have a question, Mary Lou?
I do, and it does just keep cycling around and around. I've worked a lot on the idea of extended producer responsibility, and the idea of making the original producer responsible for the end product sounds good at first blush, but boy, I have seen it in operation, and it really doesn't work. And even if it did, if you made the producer responsible for everything, the producer doesn't have to be transparent about what they do with it when they get it back. Mm-hmm. So if you make Apple responsible for all the iPhones that they've ever manufactured, then when they get them back, they don't have to tell you what they're doing with that. So you think, well, I'm going to make you responsible, but really you're just adding a little cost and they're going to build it into their business expenses. And what they actually do with the materials once they get it back, nobody is in charge of regulating that. It's not reportable to the public. There's a lot of EPR legislation being thought of and written and so on with a very good intention of trying to hold people's feet to the fire and make them accountable for what they're producing. And it's going to backfire because it turns into giving the very people who made the problem, giving them back the stuff that is the problem, and then not finding out what they do with it. So I just thought I'd throw a little cold water on that. That's all.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I agree. I think that's a case where like the legislation needs to be strong to actually be good. It needs to be strong to a point that it would absolutely never pass. So then people try to weaken it. And like you said, it has these huge loopholes that maybe it'll pass that way, but then you could argue about how much good it will do.
It's a question of not making things that are harmful. Good luck with that.
Does anybody else have any questions for Lydia before we adjourn?
Yeah,
I was wondering about fungus. Sorry I showed up late, but I was wondering about fungus. I've heard about that being used to treat some of this nasty stuff.
Yeah, there's some like super cool emerging research on like bacteria and stuff that will eat plastics and things like that. I would say at the moment it's super niche. And if it could maybe be made to a point where it could be done on such a large scale that we would solve our plastics problem, I'm a little skeptical of that. I think it would take a really long time. Similar to research that says, oh, we found out how to destroy PFAS. It's always on a really small scale, hasn't been demonstrated to be able to deal with the amount of waste that we have. So I would say super interesting, great that people are trying. And when it's scaled up, then I'll be happy.
Well, it's interesting. A couple of years ago, we had somebody on the show that talked about fungal recycling, and she was describing exactly what you just said, which is it's hard to scale it up.
Yeah.
And maybe 2 years down the road, it's better. So maybe I'll invite her back.
Yeah, you should ask her about that.
Angela, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been super informative. I'm curious if there's any good news in needing this, or what gives you hope to kind of keep doing what you're doing, given all of the barriers, challenges, and scary things that we're talking about.
Yeah. It's hard. It can be super depressing, and oftentimes it's bad when some people learn a lot about this and shut down and then don't do anything, which I think is the wrong solution. But how I stay motivated is by, meeting other people who are doing great things to tackle the same or similar problems, educating people about these problems and trying to get them to be more involved. I think on a personal level, learning about things allows you to change your behavior to improve things. And so that's how I stay motivated and happy. And if I learn that there's something harmful in a product, then I'll do what I can to eliminate that from my life. And so I think that's a way that I can feel better, is that I can use the knowledge. Yeah, it's depressing when you think about it, but can I make a change in my life to make myself healthier? And can I share it with my friends and family? So sometimes that might be, not getting hot coffee in a hot to-go cup as much as I can, because I know that a bunch of microplastics will go into that liquid. It might be not eating fish anymore because they're just way too contaminated with all sorts of products and chemicals. And it might be suggesting like a cool new brand that does great work, and I know they pay a lot of attention to harmful chemicals, and suggesting that everyone I know, buys from them. So I would say that that's how I can remain positive.
Thank you. Consumers have a lot of power. We just need to use it more.
Yep.
Doug,
Exactly.
did you have a question?
I got a quick question. What about regulations, say in other countries like the European Union? Are they making further and faster progress as far as regulation than we are?
Yeah, the EU is definitely doing a better job than we are. They're more likely to approach chemicals from a precautionary principle and thinking about needing to prove chemical safety before allowing the chemicals to be used, unlike in the US, where we just sort of let anything go, and then it's up to scientists to show over years to decades that it's harmful. Then they have to spend years to decades trying to get it out of products. So for many harmful chemicals, plastics, recycling, sort of the whole gamut, I would say the EU is doing better.
Okay, last call for questions.
John, I had two in there in the chat. One of them is, many recyclers think plastics last forever. Do you agree?
I would say pretty much forever. Yeah, as far as we need to be concerned, then you could approximate that. Yes, forever.
Secondly, I had a question. You're a practicing scientist. What do you think about this rise of non or even anti-science behavior?
Yeah, I think it's a little scary just to see how much people don't trust scientists anymore. It's definitely still not everyone. There's still plenty of people that trust scientists, but I would say that there's an issue when people openly don't respond to, sound, unbiased science. I think, it's especially an issue when things become politicized that shouldn't be politicized, like harmful chemicals, or like, wearing masks to protect ourselves from respiratory diseases. I think more of my concern is like, there's always going to be some flat earthers or whatever, but when you get people who are just like actively denying sound science, like that humans cause climate change, I think that's where the real problem lies.
Thank you. I would like to go back to that previous question just for a minute and say a couple of things about the question of whether plastics are forever. Just a couple of days ago, I reread an article in the New York Times about astronaut suits in, I think, the Smithsonian, but I can't remember whether it was that or some other museum. Anyway, here they are in
It's
an
the
environment
Smithsonian.
that's supposed to protect them against any kind of change, and they're decomposing. They're actually literally decomposing. One of the things that happens with them is that they get sticky, and I've experienced that myself being in the reuse business. You reach out and touch something that's 5 or 6 years old. That's some piece of plastic stuff that's supposed to be on your out in your picnic area or something, and it's all either sticky or it's real brittle. all those things to me suggest that plastics decompose. And I think one of the reasons is it's made out of carbon.
Yeah, so I think you know, a lot of plastics, or you could say the same thing about PFAS chemicals too, eventually they will get broken down by the sun or biological processes. But you know, are they breaking down into something that's harmful or something that's harmless? And I think a lot of the time, you know, that's how you get microplastics and nanoplastics and the chemicals that were added to the plastics, like PFAS or flame retardants or bisphenols or phthalates, leaching out and getting into our water, and then continuing and traveling the globe in our water cycle. So it can definitely change. PFAS can transform into other PFAS. Plastics can break down and break up, but they're still there, and they're going to continue to be there for, you know, centuries at least.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
And thank you for joining us, Lydia. That was really great. Very, 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 very interesting. Usually we have a segment about the recycling archives, but Susan Kinsella wasn't able to make it, so we're not doing that tonight. So I'm just going to thank Lydia for joining us and giving up her dinner time. And we do this show the second Tuesday of every month, and I hope you join us next month.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm putting my email in the chat, so feel free to reach out if you're ever curious about something, or you're a recycler and you have questions about how you can, you know, better screen for flame retardants and things like that. Always happy to chat.
Perfect. Thank you again.
Yeah.
So we were adjourning.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Great meeting you all.